Before we start this week's show, I'd like to remind you that the Brazilian Report is funded by subscriptions and support from loyal readers. As well as subscribing to our website and getting exclusive daily content on Brazil and Latin America, you can also treat our staff to 1 to 5 cups of coffee a month. And in return, you'll get exclusive benefits like special newsletters, behind-the-scenes content, as well as a shout-out here on our podcast. And today, I'd like to thank our Buy Me a Coffee members, Mark Hillary, John Thomas III, Luiz Renz, Erwan Menais, Orlando Black, Steve Knapp, Aaron Berger, James Coney, Kars Vriesvik, Alistair Townsend, Peter Abramson, Michael Fryer, Milo Renascido, Jim Awofadeju, David Dixon, Felipe Saito, Jose Ozi Stankovic, Gabriela Gref Innes, Emerging Market Muser, Yarden Iftach, Tonica Thompson, Anderson da Silva, Kat Kramer, Fra, Peter Suffren, Anna Lund, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. If you also believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, head over to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of the membership tiers. And if you can't make a monthly commitment, you can still tip us a cup of coffee every now and then to give us the energy we need to cover a country as complex as Brazil and a region as complex as Latin America. We appreciate all your support. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more. On April the 10th, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's government hit the symbolic 100-day mark. Throughout the start of the year, we at the Brazilian Report have teamed up with the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute to analyse the government's achievements and challenges, of which there have been many. And we capped off this Brazil 100 project with a live broadcast on Monday, bringing together a panel of experts to discuss how the Lula government has fared so far, covering issues ranging from Lula's foreign policy stance to his necessary environmental commitments and the government's tricky relationship with Congress. And this week on Explaining Brazil, we bring you that very conversation. So listen in for expert analysis on what to make of the first 100 days of Lula's third presidential term and what to look out for the next 100 days. Plus, our editorial team has taken a deep dive into the first 100 days of the Lula administration. We've released a special report that our subscribers can get their hands on with a special discount, so be sure to go to brazilian.report/subscribe, and we'll add the link to all of that in the show notes. Now, on with the debate.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon for those who are in Brazil. I'm Bruna Santos, Director at the Brazil Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I'm thrilled to be here in this roundtable with Tatiana Prazeres, a roundtable that is hosted by the Brazil Institute and the Brazilian Report. So thank you very much. Welcome. This conversation is on trade, foreign trade, because we have the pleasure to have here Tatiana Prazeres, who currently serves as Foreign Trade Secretary at the Ministry of Development, Industry and Commerce and Services of Brazil. And it's her second appointment to this post, which she also occupied from 2011 to 2013 in a different moment in our country. And prior to her most recent appointment to Brazil's government, she was a career public servant in the Ministry as a foreign trade analyst. And after that, she worked in Geneva with the WTO until 2018, and as a senior advisor. She joined the academia, and she has a long career as a fellow studying China, studying international relations, and also served as the head of the International Relations Department at the Federation of Industries in the state of São Paulo. And was also a professor at PUC, Rio de Janeiro. Tatiana, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us on behalf of the Wilson Center, the Brazil Institute, and the Brazilian Report. I welcome you and welcome your remarks also and analysis on trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruna. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for the invitation. This is a timely moment to talk about Brazil, to talk about the new political cycle in Brazil, of course. And I would like to take this opportunity to focus on my area of responsibility, which is obviously trade, foreign trade. I think I should start. Should I just move on, Bruna? Is there anything else you wanted to say? Should I just move on?
The floor is all yours, and then we're going to open for questions.
Great. Of course, we're in the beginning of a new political cycle in Brazil, and I should start by highlighting the reestablishment, the recreation of the Trade and Industry Ministry. Here, it's the Development, Trade, Industry, and Services Ministry, and it's just been recreated, which is a sign of the relevance of this portfolio in the current administration. But more than that, we have the honor, the privilege to have the Vice President of Brazil as Trade and Industry Minister. So that is, of course, a privilege for us, but also a responsibility, and we need to make the most of it for sure. It's also a stronger ministry than before. We have new responsibilities, new attributions, and we also have under the umbrella of the new ministry, BNDES, the Development Bank of Brazil, and Apex Brazil, the trade promotion agency of the country. So that is the big picture in terms of the institutional setting related to trade policy. And I was wondering what approach I should take when it comes to explaining the views of this administration regarding trade and what has happened since the new administration started. And one idea that occurred to me was to focus on key partners of Brazil, because one key priority of this administration is, of course, to rebuild Brazil's credibility abroad, to rebuild Brazil's credibility with sustainability at its heart. It is to reconnect Brazil with its neighbors in South America, and it is to rebuild bridges with the world. So I think with that in mind, the idea that occurred to me was really to focus on some key matters, and with no order of preference, I would start here referring to the U.S., right? Because of the platform that we are in. But of course, the United States is a very, very important partner of Brazil. President Lula has visited the U.S. during his first 100 days in government. Focus was on democracy and sustainability, but there has been a lot of action in terms of trade as well. So Vice President Alckmin spoke on the phone on what was a very productive talk with Secretary General Raimondo. And Vice President Alckmin met here in Brasilia Ambassador Catherine Tai for a very interesting conversation about issues that we have, interests and concerns that we have in common with the U.S., when we look at trade in general. So in the first 100 days of this administration, in terms of trade with the U.S., I would highlight these two very high-level talks. And in addition to that, I also held a conversation with my counterpart, the Secretary Marisa Lago, and we talked about the U.S.-Brazil commercial dialogue. We talked about how to build a constructive work stream on trade and sustainability. I think we all acknowledge the importance of the topic, and we really want to work together on that agenda. I also wanted to highlight the U.S. Brazil CEO Forum, which is a well-established, productive platform. I understand the U.S. has renewed its list of CEOs, and we're looking to fix a date for a new meeting. And we're looking forward to that. We value very much all these dialogues that we have with the United States, but I understand that at this point in time, we have an opportunity to work closer with the U.S., including on issues such as trade and sustainability. I wanted to move on now to South America and Argentina. Of course, the region is very important for this administration. We want to work closer together with our neighbors. And of course, Argentina is a very important country for us, not only for being a neighbor, but also as a key player of Mercosur, which is the customs union that both countries are part of. So there's been a presidential visit to Argentina. I participated in that visit, but more than that, I think with Argentina, the dialogue, the links with Argentina needed some repair or need of repairing. And the reestablishment of the institutional dialogue, trade dialogue between the two governments was announced, and we were able to convene again. So that institutional setting had not met since 2019. And in the first 100 days of this administration, we managed to restore the commercial dialogue with Argentina, and we had our first meeting. Of course, with Argentina, we have very intense discussions in terms of trade, but we feel that there are genuine efforts to find solutions to expand trade. The trade with Argentina is one of high quality. We have a lot of small and medium companies engaged in trade with Argentina. We have manufactured products, etc., etc. It's not always easy, but we're working very closely with them, and that is very important. If you don't have the dialogue, you don't have the means to improve the quality of the relationship. And now we have the dialogue, and we're looking for opportunities to increase the predictability of trade flows with Argentina, but also to expand investment and trade opportunities in general. So South America and Argentina are definitely a country and an area that are priorities for this administration. I wanted to move on to China now. So President Lula is traveling to China tomorrow. I'm very pleased to join his delegation to Shanghai and Beijing. And I think with China as well, we have an opportunity to strengthen our relationship. There's an opportunity to expand the agenda with China to include sustainability in our discussions, to explore new opportunities in science and technology, to look at investments in infrastructure, etc., etc. I think with China, trade and investments have evolved over the years, but now there is an opportunity for us to look into other areas of cooperation, and I think that that is very important for Brazil. I wanted now just to move quickly to the European Union, which is, of course, a very important partner for us, all European countries, but the European Union in particular now, because we have been working with the EU to conclude an association agreement for over 20 years. So in 2019, there was an announcement of a pre-agreement, a political agreement, but the agreement has not been concluded. In fact, in 2019, after the conclusion or the pre-conclusion of the trade part of the negotiation, talks have lost traction. Let's put it that way. There hasn't been enough engagement to cross the finish line and to conclude that agreement. So we're very pleased with the interest on the EU part to engage with Mercosur with the view of concluding what we want to be a balanced agreement. So in February, EU negotiators came to Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires is the Mercosur pro tempore capital. And they presented to Mercosur countries what their views were about how to conclude the negotiations. And it is no secret that the EU had concerns with sustainability in Brazil in the past, and they want that to be part of the discussions that we have with them in the context of this association agreement. We, as Mercosur countries, we have our concerns, and we are working hard with our EU counterparts to conclude this agreement in the near future. I won't put a date to it, but we're looking forward to engaging with them and finding constructive solutions for what we want to be a balanced agreement. Concluding an agreement with the European Union is important in itself, but it also sends a signal to the world that Mercosur, as a customs union, is able to conclude trade agreements. And it also shows our interest as the Brazilian government to expand the network of agreements that we currently have. We believe there's room for us to do that, and we do believe that that is important for the country, for the economy, for productivity gains that we need to achieve for us to become more competitive at the global level. Let me just conclude here my 15 minutes remark with some key message. I'm confident that this administration understands the value of increasing Brazil's participation in the global economy. And my comments related to the EU-Mercosur negotiations, they go in that direction. President Lula himself mentioned that a couple of times. Vice President Alckmin himself also highlighted the importance of expanding the network of trade agreements for Brazil. And I think that is something that is definitely a mark of this of the vision of this administration in terms of trade. Second point is we want to work hard to make trade more inclusive. And to make trade more inclusive, we want to work closer with SMEs, with small and medium companies. We want to work to enlarge the exporting base of Brazil. We want more companies to benefit from the opportunities related to trade. Today, trade in Brazil is largely concentrated on medium and mostly large companies, and we believe there's a room for us to increase the number of companies that benefit from trade. We are also talking about making trade more inclusive. We've just launched a report that presents trade data disaggregated by gender. So we now have a clear picture of how trade affects women in Brazil, both as workers and as company owners. So based on that data, we also want to work on policy that is responsive, that is sensitive to that kind of data. But making trade more inclusive, making sure that more companies benefit from trade is something that that drives our action here at the ministry. Finally, and third, a key message that I wanted to leave you with is this focus of the new administration on reindustrializing Brazil, or new industrialization, if you want. So I think this is not something that Brazil only is looking for. I think this is a discussion that is happening at the global level. But here we are committed to looking into how we can strengthen the industrial base of the country, how we can enlarge the participation of the industry in the production of the country, and that can only be pursued through sustainability and digital transformation of our companies. So these two pillars, I think, go hand in hand: digitalization and sustainability, and they are part of a wider, bigger strategy that also has in its core the need for the Brazilian economy to be more exposed in a competitive manner to the global economy. So I'll stop here, but in a nutshell, if you want to look at the partners that we've been focusing since we started, I think I would mention those that just listed. And in terms of key messages, I would say that those three are the ones that I wanted to underscore here. Happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this fantastic overview, Tatiana. And I have to say that I believe that we Brazilians are very lucky to have professionals like yourself in the Brazil's government today, like working to position Brazil in the global stage, in the global economy, as you are. One of my first questions is kind of broad, but I think it's of interest, which is, now it's a very, I think we're still learning and interpreting how Brazil is navigating the global competition between US and China in terms of both like foreign policy, but also in terms of trade and investment too. So I want to hear more from you about that, and what is your interpretation of what are the guidelines for Brazil in navigating those not very often like calm waters. And two is you have a vast experience in China and you were going to Beijing. And I want to hear from you. How do you see the discussion around Brazil entering the Belt and Road Initiative, how it would benefit Brazil or not by joining this initiative in terms of attracting investments in infrastructure and in trade?
On your first point, U.S.-China dynamics, I think not only Brazil, but the entire world is learning how to navigate the complexities related to what has become the most important, the defining relationship of our times. It is not an easy task, but I'm convinced that Brazil needs to look for its own interests wherever they are. I think, I mean, I can elaborate a little bit on that, but that gives you a sense of our view that Brazil, of course, should not take sides and should try to look for its own interests, regardless of alignments, automatic alignments that maybe some are considering. So that's where that's my comment on your first question. I hear your second question. I'm sorry. Can you? How do you see the discussions about Brazil entering the Belt and Road Initiative? Okay. President Lula, as you all know, is going to China tomorrow. So I'd rather not address that question now. Let me just say that overall, I think there is an investment a gap at the global level, and I think we should work together. I'm not referring to working only with China. I think we work together at the global level to address challenges related to the infrastructure and connectivity gap. That is something that really hinders development worldwide. I will stop there on the BRI question, but happy to take any other.
Okay, so we got another question from the audience, which is very interesting now on nearshoring. So how do you think that has the government taken a concrete plan to take advantage of all this like nearshoring push and achieve the goal of reindustrialization? How do you see that?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think there's been a lot of talks about that. We're looking at how to position Brazil as a player, as a country that can attract foreign investment in a way to deal with these changes in supply chains happening at the global level. To begin with, I think Brazil has an opportunity to tackle costs, as we call Brazil costs, right? Costs associated with bureaucracy, inefficiencies, to the tax system that is, of course, a burden to companies willing to invest in the country. There's an opportunity for us to improve our infrastructure so as to reduce costs related to logistics, et cetera, et cetera. I think this global discussion on changes in supply chains is an opportunity for Brazil to look at the areas where costs can be cut, so as to position Brazil as a key destination in terms of potential investments. They're looking for new destinations in the context of geopolitical changes in the world. I think that's the starting point. How can we position ourselves as a key destination in this new environment, and where are the opportunities for us to cut costs and really make Brazil a more interesting country for investment? Brazil is already a very important destination of FDI, but I think this new scenario create new opportunities for us, and that's, I think, where we should start. In addition to that, so I think that's the first that's the starting point, really. In addition to that, I think we need to look carefully into the policies that are being implemented in different countries and look into how we can benefit from that in a concrete manner, in a pragmatic manner, without putting ourselves in a difficult position. If we as Brazil want to be a global partner, if we want to work with different countries, as I said, looking for our interests wherever they are. I understand that the United States, for example, in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, has been pursuing a policy to somehow orientate investments in a certain direction for certain purposes, etc., etc. Well, maybe these are opportunities for us, and we're looking into those. These are part of the conversations we've been having with our counterparts, and we're looking into those issues with great interest as well. So I think I would look into the issue looking at these two layers, right? I think there's one horizontal layer about making Brazil more attractive to foreign investments. And then the second layer would be how to make good use of opportunities associated, incentives associated with policies that are being implemented in other countries. And then I would say a third one, working with companies, because to a certain extent, these changes in value chains can be associated with governmental policies. But in addition to that, I think companies themselves are looking into introducing more resiliency to their value chains, and therefore looking to Brazil as a location for their investments is something that we can discuss with companies themselves. And we are interested in making the most of this opportunity to help Brazil foster its reindustrialization goals. So I think this is it. I will look at this 3 levels.
These 3 levels, fantastic. And it's very interesting because those are something that we are observing closely here at the Brazil Institute, especially when it comes to what are the opportunities that are related to energy transition, and such as the fact that Brazil has big reserves of critical minerals and so on. So that's something that we would be very happy to observe along with here. So thank you so much, Tatiana. I think we reached the 12:30 here, and without further ado, I will ask you for just final remarks, and I want to thank you again and wish you safe travels to Beijing.
I just hope I can move on and just thank you for the opportunity. I hope we'll have other occasions to engage, hopefully in person as well. I think the dialogue with civil society, with the business community, with everyone interested in how trade affects the economy, lives, development, etc., is something that we're very keen to discuss. And the U.S., of course, is a key partner for Brazil. I'm looking forward to engaging with my U.S. counterparts and with the business community to explore all the opportunities we have to strengthen our links. So I thank you very much, Bruna. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you for those watching us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tatiana. And I want to ask the audience to stay tuned in this link, because we will be together soon in a conversation with my colleagues from the Brazilian Report, and also our global fellows, Luiz Duarte, Nick Zimmerman, and Nathalie Unterschall from Brazil, who are going to be looking and interpreting some of the events Lula's first 100 days in government. So thank you so much, and I see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Hello, my name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and I would like to welcome you to the part 2 of this Brazil 100 conference, in which we will have a broad discussion about Lula's first 100 days. And throughout the start of the Lula administration, the Brazilian Report has teamed up with the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute to analyze the challenges and the achievements of these new administration through a series of articles, podcasts, and op-eds. And you can follow them, you can read them and listen to them on our website, Brazilian.report, and also on the Brazil Institute's website, which is on the wilsoncenter.org website. The Brazil 100 project was kicked off on Inauguration Day, January the 1st, when we hosted a live broadcast with the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute to discuss the challenges of the Lula administration, which was just starting on January the 1st. So much has happened since, and this project now concludes today with the roundtable between Bruna and Tatiana Prazeres of the Trade and Industry Ministry, and now this remote conference bringing together experts to discuss the government's first 100 days. So I'd like to welcome to our conversation welcome back Bruna Santos. She is the director of the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. Hello, Bruna. I would also like to welcome Cede Silva. He is the Brazilian Report's Brasilia correspondent and our Congress correspondent. Hello, Cede.
Hello, Gustavo and everyone. Good afternoon.
I would also like to thank Nick Zimmerman and Luisa Duarte. They are both Brazil Institute Global Fellows. Hello, Nick. Hello, Luisa.
Hello, Gustavo. Thanks for having me.
And last but not least, Nathalie Unterstel. She's head of the Talanoa Institute, a climate-centered think tank. Hello, Nathalie. Glad to have you.
Hello, Gustavo. Thank you for having me. Good to see everyone here today.
And just before we start our conversation, I'd like to talk about the fact that we at the Brazilian Report have just launched this today, a special report on the first 100 days of the Lula administration, which is prefaced by Bruna of the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. So we'll just leave you with a few seconds of a message about our report, and we'll be right back.
Before continuing the show, we'd like to introduce you to our latest release, our exclusive report on the first 100 days of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's third term as Brazilian president. Lula's 100 days, myriad challenges and unforced errors is a valuable strategic tool that brings you in-depth analysis from our experts on the most important issues from the beginning of Lula's administration. In this exclusive report, you'll find insights and analysis on the government's support base in Congress, Brazil's return to foreign policy, fiscal, economic and environmental challenges, as well as how the administration is tackling social media regulation and planning to fight hunger. Don't miss this opportunity and use the coupon to get a 20% discount on the report. Enjoy your read.
Okay, so without further ado, Bruna, thanks for the roundtable with Tatiana. It was fascinating to listen to your conversation. And now I want to put you on the spot and ask you, because the 100-day mark is this landmark that has gotten a lot of symbolism in modern politics. In Brazil, it is complicated because Congress only takes office a month into the president's administration, so there are additional challenges for a president to put his own brand in his first 100 days. And this period of time, which is usually known as a honeymoon period, in Lula's case, if there was a honeymoon, it ended with a case of domestic violence and one of the spouses trashing the hotel room because of all the things that happened. Lula faced this sort of seditious revolt in Brasilia, a credit crisis, a lot of economic challenges. So I would like to ask you, with that in mind, with all the challenges, and you and I have talked about some of those throughout these 100 days while we were discussing the project that we launched together, what is your general assessment of these first 100 days?
Okay, so in one word, I think it's been underwhelming in a certain point, not for us because we have worked a lot, right, Gustavo? And here I want to start with a personal thank you note to you and your team and the Brazilian Report for joining the Wilson Center Brazil Institute in this collaboration, in this partnership to interpret the first 100 days. And I want to just send a few personal thank you notes to Thalita Fernandes, Israel, you, Gustavo, of course, and the Brazilian Report, Oscar, Joseph, and everyone who supported our efforts throughout those 100 days. We had a lot to cover, I think, and the result of that, I think, is not only the report, but all the content and media mentions and podcasts and different articles and events that we had here at the Brazil Institute with the Secretary Tatiana Rosito. Tatiana Prazeres now also a conversation with the cabinet, Lula's cabinet minister, Vinicius Marques de Carvalho, and other different opportunities that we had, not only to look at those events, but also helping interpreting it to the foreign audience. And one of the things, first of all, I think we're saying that, put into perspective, the Lula's 100 days started earlier. due to the absence of former President Bolsonaro from public appearances and in any transition right, like officially. So I think that the first 100 days of Lula have been some sort of baptism of fire. And I think that the achievements are still modest. I think that one big achievement, of course, is the semblance of normalcy to Brazil's political landscape, which is back. But the progress in agendas could be faster. So one of the things that, of course, marked those events is that, okay, we started in that first live on January 1st. I remember we were all kind of in an electoral tension hangover. The whole country was like, okay, Lula got elected, but we had a very tense weeks throughout the election because we were all like looking closely on whether or not the rule of law would be respected in terms of the results of the election. And not to mention, of course,
it's important to mention, and I'm sorry if I cut you.
Yeah, sure.
But it was the narrowest win in Brazilian democratic history, right? I mean, just less than 2 percentage points.
Yeah, it's razor thin. It's nothing. I mean, for Brazil, it's like it's very, there's a very few, it's an arrows. It was I think was one election that was very atypical and also consequential in a number of different terms. And also I think that, okay, so then you had like the first week in government, Lula had the January 8th storming, which represented a major event in Brazil's democracy history, recent history, but also it brought to the surface, not left new scars, but brought to the surface other scars of our redemocratization process. So the fact that Lula incentivized a comprehensive judiciary-led investigation after those events, and that he took measures responding to those events by rethinking the way that the military were present in the core of government is important to note. So the fact that the Brazil's civilian intelligence agency, ABIN, was till now, very recent, under the control of the military, and Lula changed that after those events is something that worth mentioning. I think those are big, important, and long-awaited changes in the Brazil's intelligence system. I think another thing that is evident to all of us is what you call in the report that you were launching this shaky coalition. I think that Lula's policy agenda faces an uphill battle in a very divided Congress, which will require his skills in maneuvering to build consensus and push through his agenda. But one aspect of concern to me about everything that happened in this 100 days is in face of as the Supreme Court decision that ruled the secret budget scheme unconstitutional, Lula needed to, of course, expand his government support base in the National Congress by granting with a new form of political distribution mechanism of resources that came directly from the ministries to political appointments, keeping, in my opinion, is still very high risks of corruption in his government. That's one aspect of concern to me. It's also something that we should look closely, and also as a civil society that is looking at how the compliance culture is evolving in Brazil, we should also look what will be the unexpected effects coming out of that. Second, I think is in terms of Lula's foreign policy and diplomatic efforts, and I'm sure other colleagues are going to dig in on that. I think Brazil's pursuit of a more influential role in the global stage is evident. It will come with trade-offs and challenge, navigating very complex waters because the world has changed a lot since Lula was in government. He's going to China and is going to see a totally different China than the one that he negotiated back in the days. And I think he has made has had a very successful agenda, making sure that Brazil, that the world knew that Brazil is back. He even chose to use the same slogan as former President Temer did, Brazil is back. and reestablished ties with traditional allies, and has been working on reestablishing Brazil's credibility and navigating certain issues that Brazil was like for a long time distant or not taken seriously in conversations. One point, of course, and an important hook for him is the climate and environmental agenda. I'm sure Nathalie is going to talk more about it, but we'll still see a certain level, sort of like a cocktail of ambivalence and certain level of naivety when it comes to certain discussions. For example, how Brazil is navigating the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how we see certain ambivalent messages being sent in that matter. And we see Brazil hearkening back to some sort of Brazil's freestyle diplomacy of the 2000s, but in a moment where we are not going to be able to afford to take very strong sides on coalitions. So the coalitions are going to be looser than we saw before in Lula's foreign policy and PT's foreign policy in the past. But in general, I think we are facing a ticking clock to deliver economic results and to avoid a popularity crisis that will leave the executive at the mercy of Congress. And as of now, I think that Lula is making moves in presenting a new fiscal framework, taking Brazil back to the global stage and building bridges and important conversations that will be important for Brazil's, as Tatiana just mentioned, reindustrialization policies and efforts. But as of now, his government has largely been recycling policies from his previous term. And it's been, to me, underwhelming in terms of achievements. Of course, it's only 100 days. The Congress took office in February. Those were very compressed, moments in our history. But the landscape, politically and economically, is not good ahead of us. So there will be still a number of the need for more analysis, shedding light on the challenges and trade-offs that come with Brazil's pursuit to have a more influential role on the global stage will be definitely needed.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that lead us, and I agree with your assessment that these have been somewhat underwhelming at 100 days, even if with a lot of positive aspects. But I think one of the reasons why it seems so underwhelming is because the government took office with this incredibly ambitious agenda, and that usually this is a moment where governments have more push to pass a lot of things that may be unpopular, that may be harder to get passed in Congress, and we essentially haven't seen that much happening. The government still seems everyone not on the same page on messaging. We still see that this big tent coalition that Lula built may be too heterogeneous to reach some goals in certain areas. Do you see at this point, and again, like you said, it's just 100 days of more than 1,000 days still left, but do you see a brand of these new government? Is there anything that is a staple of this third Lula iteration as president?
I think that, honestly, this government had lost the opportunity to set a new policy agenda for Brazil in a post-Bolsonaro era. What people are talking about is this, we are still talking about we are not getting things done as fast, but we also don't have a vision that is out there to bring Brazil back to the global stage, to actually have achievements that are addressing the hunger crisis that the country is going through. And of course, it has a lot to do with the difficult to coordinate a very broad interests within government in a hostile environment with Congress that is no longer as clear as it was, I think, when Lula was in government. I think that the trade-offs are going to be higher. The stakes are higher too. So I don't see a brand. Even the Brazil is Back brand is recycled. So Brazil has been back they have tried that before. So I think even that is recycled. I see the lack of like a new vision. What is it that we want and that we can achieve in this first term of third term of Lula, and perhaps the one before his fourth term.
And you mentioned Lula's coalition, and you mentioned his arrangement with budgetary grants. So that, for me, is a good segue for us to bring CD into the conversation. CD Silva, who is our Brasília correspondent. And CD, I want to start the conversation with you by talking about the fact that Lula was elected under this huge coalition, not a big tent, but a huge tent. And now we are seeing, after 100 days, that building a support base in Congress has been much harder than anticipated. So what you have seen now, what is the government's footing in the legislature? Because the agenda is quite ambitious, and it will need Congress to play ball with the government. So what's the state of things in Brasília, just a few kilometers from where you are?
I agree with Bruna that the Lula administration has lost some opportunities on these 100 days and could do more because, in my understanding, there have been a lot of small good news for Lula and Lula's coalition, not as much because of the strength of the government, but because of the decisions by the opposition. I would highlight 5 of them recently, which are very good news for Lula. First, the mixed joint congressional committees are back this week after House Speaker Arthur Lira essentially played a game of chicken, but he blinked first, and the committees are back. We do not know yet if they're going to be back on the old format that gives the Senate and the House equal power, which is the format that House Speaker Arthur Lira wants to change, but they're going to be back regardless, and the senators are much ready to do the work on these committees.
By the way, just for a piece of context, these committees are responsible for analyzing provisional decrees issued by the president, which is a way of the president to enact legislation and enact legislation that is enforced immediately but has to be passed within 120 days. Otherwise, it expires. And that includes measures, even like the very structure of the government is approved through a provisional decree. So if that game of chicken was still going on, we could see the very structure of the government be at least temporarily dissolved.
Precisely, and that also goes for Lula's provisional measures on important programs such as Bolsa Família, the program with cash stipends for the poorest Brazilians, and also Minha Casa Minha Vida, which is Lula's habitation program, Lula's program to build houses. They're all in provisional measures, which are due to expire very soon. And House Speaker Arthur Lira was playing a chicken game, basically not installing those committees and letting those provisional measures expire. But they're back, and they're back this week. And this is good news for the Lula administration. Second, the Joint Select Committee on the January 8 riots was not yet created. Much like in the United States, there is a revisionist movement by the far right to gaslight what happened and to blame the Lula administration solely and infiltrated leftists, which are not existent, and to greenlight what happened about the January 8 riots. And despite the opposition's efforts, this committee has not been installed yet. The third thing is the opposition has, as I predicted, behaving mostly about culture wars and talking points. Recently, they held this public hearing with Justice Minister Flávio Dino, and nobody knows exactly what Dino spoke about, because everyone that heard about this public hearing was talking about Congressman Nicolas Ferreira and André Janones talking back and forth and exchanging expletives and exchanging curse words. And nobody knows exactly, nobody paid attention to the minister who was supposedly going to be grilled. The fourth thing is Senator Flávio Bolsonaro, which is the eldest son of former President Jair Bolsonaro, has openly talked about his leaning towards approving the name of lawyer Cristiano Zanin who will likely be Lula's next appointment to the Supreme Court. And finally, Bolsonaro's return to Brazil, which was a very, very hyped event, much highly anticipated by his Liberal Party, with a lot of press and a lot of talk about his going back from the United States, was a major flop. It was a flop. It was attended by a few dozen people. And Minister Alexandre Padilha, who is the minister of the Lula administration in charge of relations with Congress, even said so, using the English word flop. So there has been a lot of recent good news for the Lula administration, not because of the strength of the government, but because of the weakness of the opposition.
So let's talk about also what the challenges that the government still is going to face, because we have main agenda points such as a tax reform, such as the fiscal framework that Finance Minister Fernando Haddad presented a few weeks ago, last week, with a plan to curb, to prevent public spending from ballooning. These all require Congress approval. The fiscal framework, just simple majority, but the tax reform, constitutional majority of 6%, and 2 rounds of voting in each congressional chamber. So those are a lot of votes, and Bruna alluded to how Lula plans to whip these votes. In your opinion, Sadeh, what are the main hurdles this legislature could pose to the administration? Because I think one of the key differences between Lula 1 and Lula 2, as opposed to Lula 3 now, is the fact that now we have a far right that is very well organized. And even if, like you said, they stay blocked on cultural war themes, they still manage to do a lot of noise and to try and block some of the government's initiatives in Congress, right?
Yes, but I still think that on those cases, the main challenge for the Lula administration to get those votes in Congress is to actually present those bills in Congress in the first place, which the Lula administration has so far not done. Our foreign audience, probably people with business in Brazil, are mostly interested with the big 2 things, which are the new fiscal framework and the tax reform proposal. The fiscal framework was not yet formally presented to Congress. We do not have the actual text of this new fiscal framework. Because of this, it still does not have a rapporteur in the House, and so the discussion simply cannot proceed, because in 100 days, the Lula administration has not actually submitted to Congress this fiscal framework. So it's only up to the Lula administration to make this walk forward. The same thing with the tax reform proposal. There is a proposal that has been discussed during the Bolsonaro administration, and the Lula administration is trying to recycle this proposal, but they are doing this with an informal working group as opposed to a committee. And the difference is, in a working group, you can appoint whoever you want, and in a formal committee, the parties, the composition of the parties and of the caucuses must follow proportionally according to their representation in the whole of the House. And since the tax reform is being discussed in this informal working group, the strength of the Lula administration has not been tested, because it is being done in an informal working group that was appointed and with a heavy representation from lawmakers of the state of Amazonas, which are interested in keeping the tax-free zone there in Manaus, the capital of Amazonas. The other 3 things that the Lula administration has promised but not yet delivered, not even to Congress, are the proposal to tax and regulate sports betting platforms. Justice Minister Flávio Dino promised a so-called anti-coup package with measures to avoid something similar to January 8 again. And also, the Lula administration has been promising for the last 3 months regulation of the so-called anti-fake news department of the Attorney General's office, of the AGU. All these 5 things: fiscal framework, tax reform, a proposal to tax sports betting, the anti-coup package, and the regulation of the anti-fake news department, they have not yet been delivered. And they have not been submitted to Congress, or in the case of regulation of fake news, not published in the official Gazette, and it's just a Lula decision, a Lula administration decision, not to submit those things. So the opposition has not yet had the opportunity, Gustavo, to actually oppose something because the Lula administration has not submitted it to Congress. And as I've said, the Lula administration is missing an opportunity because most of the far right and most of these people who are still allied to Bolsonaro in Congress, they're basically concerned with transphobic fantasies and cultural wars agendas. And you have only a few lawmakers who are concerned with serious things. For example, Senator Rogério Marinho, who is keeping an eye on Lula's revision to the sanitation framework. But these are few and far between. And so the Lula administration has not yet submitted to Congress what it has been promising to do.
Yeah, and the problem is, like you said, it's been 100 days and we still don't know how strong the government's footing is in Congress. So there, thanks for that explanation about what is going on in Brazil. I'd like to bring Nick into the conversation. And by the way, if you guys want to jump in and add anything to our conversation with the panelists, feel free to do it. Nick, first of all, thanks for being with us. And I'd like to ask you, Bruna, she mentioned that Lula is doing this sort of freestyle diplomacy, which is a throwback to that quote-unquote active and upstanding diplomacy that it was the model of his diplomacy during his first 8 years in office. Do you agree with Bruna's reading? How do you see this kickoff of Lula's diplomacy this time around?
Well, Gustavo, again, thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be with so many experts and on such a great occasion, marking 100 days of a new democratically elected government. I am a native, born and raised of New York City, the birthplace of hip hop. So for me, freestyle means something improvised. And under that interpretation, I don't think that the approach thus far in terms of Lula's foreign policy has been one of improvisation or freestyle. I do think it's been, to Bruna's point, quite active and in fact effective, intense, and trying to deliver our message of Brazil being back on the global stage. But for the most part, with some key differences, both the intensity of the foreign policy approach and the trajectory of its focus are not terribly surprising. We saw President-elect Lula head to the COP. Bruna and others mentioned how climate diplomacy and multilateral climate negotiations, green finance, and the rest will be one of the pillars of Brazil's new foreign policy. And we saw that as he traveled, of course, to participate along with the folks who ultimately composed his cabinet, along with Environment Minister Marina Silva. And then we saw the first traditional trip, prioritizing the region, right? He goes to Buenos Aires, he stops in Montevideo to talk about Mercosur, right? But the first emphasis on sort of, Latin American and South American integration. More recently, we've seen Brazil returning to UNASUR. It's always prioritized that under most governments, if not the last one. Then we saw the visit to Washington, and of course, as it has been mentioned, the trip to Beijing, actually leaving later today. And I think that we see a lot of the core traditional tenets, pillars of Brazilian foreign policy coming back to the fore. Not that all of them were completely abandoned during the Bolsonaro administration, though some of them were. But again, we've seen a lot more talk about the need for the reform of the United Nations and the multilateral system. We're seeing a return to, or maybe for the first time, a really more vocal environmental advocacy, not just in terms of the old multilateral cleavages about the need for the developed world to pay up, but also some new initiatives like working with Indonesia and Congo, the potential to negotiate, carbon markets with China are some new details, right? And then, of course, the age-old push or emphasis on establishing more of a multipolar, quote unquote, order in the parlance of Itamaraty, the Brazilian foreign ministry, that has as one tenet a world that's less U.S. dominant in this post-Cold War era.
And Nick, if I may jump in, I'm sorry, but one of the key aspects where we see this push for a more multipolar world order is Brazil's approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? And in that sense, Brazilian diplomacy hasn't changed that much from what the stance Brazil had during the Bolsonaro administration, a position of neutrality, a formal position of neutrality, and Brazilian diplomats trying to lobby in the UN for softer language on Russia and trying to claim that an overt condemnation of Russia would be a major roadblock to peace negotiations. So how do you see Lula's approach to the war?
So as I was about to say, Gustavo, indeed, the push for that multipolar order at a time while Europe is at war, U.S.-China tensions just seemingly keep rising. Brazil has, re-emphasized again BRICS at a time when, of course, BRICS has as its member Russia, which is the aggressor in said European war, is perhaps what is new and tricky here. It's not that it's a departure from Bolsonaro per se, and in fact, I said there was some continuity there in places, but it's just more broadly that the world is new. And so the implications of Brazil's return to a diplomatic tradition where it tries to play all of the major powers off of each other to advance a uniquely Brazilian interest, it looks a bit different than perhaps the last time Lula was president in ways that I think are problematic. In terms of the approach and this push to be a peacemaker in the first 100 days when it comes to Ukraine, I think what we're really seeing is a head of state who is motivated by legacy. I don't think we can ever forget about the broader trajectory of Lula, the heights that he climbed when he was first president, leaving office with nearly 80% approval ratings, having taken tens of millions of Brazilians out of extreme poverty, to the corruption charges that followed and the depths that he sank to include being imprisoned. And I think that whether we're talking about economic, domestic policy, or foreign policy, a frame for understanding Lula 3.0 is he wants to get back to where he left the last time around. And he sees Ukraine and inserting Brazil into that process as a key mediator, I think, is part of that, enshrining Brazil's rebirth and Lula's resurrection on the global stage. I don't think it's surprising or difficult to understand that Brazil would want and should have a role in some eventual negotiation. I hope we get there as a leader of the global South. I think what's much more problematic is the way that Lula and his advisors have gone about trying to message that. It's misguided, in my opinion, and it's creating increasing and unnecessary offense in Western capitals. There is an undercurrent in Lula's rhetoric, in National Security Advisor Celso Amorim's rhetoric, in Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira's rhetoric, that that Washington and perhaps parts of Europe are warmongers somehow, that they brought this war in some measure upon itself. I think part of this is the hangover and the legacy of the Iraq War coming home to roost, that the United States has lost a lot of credibility in the world, and people are concerned about its intentions. So it's very easy as a talking point from the Brazilian government to brag, quote unquote, about being a country of peace, pointing to its decisions to deny munitions that could be useful to the Ukrainians and kind of cutting the conversation off there as a talking point. But I think the question that's raising in Washington and in Brussels and in other European capitals is, does engagement with Putin via US and EU channels to prevent the war, which we see dating back to mid-2021 when Biden and Putin met in Geneva, when Bill Burns, the CIA director, travels to meet with Putin in November, and they're snubbed. So does that type of engagement, proactively trying to prevent a war, not receiving a strong encouragement from the Russians in response, and then if they had denied munitions to the Ukrainians, thereby facilitating essentially an easy military takeover Ukraine, Is that warmongering? Or is that trying to defend an aggrieved, invaded upon nation? And now, of course, most recently, we have a statement from Lula on Crimea that essentially Ukraine and President Zelensky should consider giving it up. And it is interesting, to say the least, to see a country like Brazil that holds its sovereignty so near and dear seemingly be so willing to negotiate away the territory and sovereignty of another. It also seems a bit simplistic. If the strategy is to endear Brasilia to Russia and China, precisely to serve as an interlocutor, it's the type of posture that doesn't engender trust in Washington and elsewhere. To simply bring, quote unquote, Ukraine along on a Brazilian envisioned initiative. Moreover, gifting Crimea officially to Russia has essentially been the world's policy since 2014. And where did that get us? It got us here. It doesn't seem like the accommodation of Putin has worked. It also seems far-fetched that Crimea as a concession would be enough to get a peace deal done, given how much Moscow has sacrificed in the process. And so it's befuddling, to say the least. And I think this is a space to watch as Brazil continues to take steps to usher in its resurgence on the global stage.
Yeah, I would add to Nick's understanding that this is not a consequence or a hangover from the Iraq war. This is essential to Workers' Party foreign policy decisions. This left-wing ideology that is still informs Lula's foreign policy, and it's part of the same understanding that has informed the decision of removing visa waivers for U.S., Australian, Japanese, and Canadian citizens, which the Lula administration has announced it will do in October, because they demand reciprocity from the big Western powers, as opposed to taking into account whether or not there are hundreds of thousands of Americans crossing the border to live in Brazil and to work illegally in Brazil. So it's part of the same ideology, my understanding, that they're going to stand up to the Western powers and be closer to Russia and China, regardless whether or not if the Iraq war had never happened.
So I think you misunderstood my point a bit, Sede. Moreover, I don't think that all of these issues are mutually exclusive. I think one point that I was trying to make is, as the United States, this current administration, the Biden administration, has made a point of trying to rally the world of democracies to counter the invasion of a democratic country, one of the reasons why its credibility has been constrained in parts of the global South, not just Brazil, is because of the legacy and the hangover of the Iraq war. That you yourself, Washington, has a track record in the advance of your own national interest to invade other countries, right? And therefore, what makes this different? Is that the totality of the story? No. I think, but it's just one aspect of it. Though I agree with all of the points that you made as also being dynamics involved in the posture. Again, these things, as you know well, living and covering Brasilia, usually there are many motives and objectives involved in how these things shake out.
You mentioned that there is legitimacy in Brazil wanting to have this role, to play this role of a peacemaker, but the question to you is it realistic? Because I'm a skeptical of soft power. I think soft power stems from hard power. I remember, for instance, when Lula brokered a deal with Iran and Turkey, some experts say that it was an even better deal to contain Iran at the time. But the U.S. had no regard for that deal, and Obama did his own deal with Iran afterwards. So at the time, Lula's efforts did little than put Brazil in an awkward position with the U.S. Do you think it is realistic for Brazil to want to have the central peacemaking role, considering that Brazil remains a peripheral country in the global stage, even if a global South power?
Well, I personally don't agree that Brazil is a peripheral actor in world affairs, period. And certainly not at a time where Europe is at war and it sits on the UN Security Council. So, Gustavo, with all due respect, part of the premise of your question, I have a different vision. And I think that we're seeing in a world of profound polarization between the United States and China, that the relative importance of the major global South countries is only growing in importance. So there's the current reality, the recent past, right, and the trajectory moving forward in the conflict that doesn't really seem like it's going to end anytime soon. And more importantly, a lot of the negative externalities from that, the breakdown in diplomacy at the UN, rising food prices, inflation, energy prices, all of it, right? It seems like it's here to stay. So I think that we need to engage a broader body of countries on how to address some of the fundamental challenges before the world, whether from climate to development to economic cooperation to, yes, questions of peace and security. So again, I think there is space for the Brazils and the Indias, and in fact, a need for these countries to do more. But then it becomes a question of how and where and what's the focus. And my point is that in the specifics, but not in the abstract, the ambition that Brazil has to play a productive, constructive role on the leading issues of the day, I think is very welcome and overdue and isn't a stretch. The problem is in the particulars thus far in these, a very, very small amount of time, 100 days, which we've seen a track record of false equivalency, some naivete, and frankly, a bit of an undercurrent. It seems that's almost anti-Ukraine, anti-West. And that specifically, I think, is more problematic and engenders a degree of mistrust, right, that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy of it not working out.
All right. With that, I want to bring in Luiz, because she's going to talk about the other pillar of Brazil's diplomatic Brazil's diplomatic stance and how Brazil is positioning itself on the global scene, which is climate diplomacy. And since Lula attended still as president-elect, the UN conference, climate conference, saying that Brazil would be back, that he would try to bring the climate conference to the Amazon rainforest, then he confirmed to the city of Belém more specifically. So Luisa, thanks for being with us. How do you see Lula's climate diplomacy? Because we can argue that his climate goals were as ambitious as any president in Brazil.
Thank you, Gustavo, and thank you, Bruna and the Brazil Institute for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, discussing this last 100 days, very intense. We saw a large focus on foreign policy, as Nick mentioned before. The Brazilian MFA agenda was intense, very intense, and previous Lula's government already indicated his big appetite for foreign affairs. The difference this time relies on environmental protection as a central driver, environmental protection as a transversal component on public policy and present in all the ministers. Even before starting his term, Lula attended COP27 in Egypt to display his will to engage on environmental protection, but specifically to contain a crisis, to remediate Bolsonaro's heavily criticized records and the climate and environmental agenda. So this new administration invested this past 3 months pretty much in highlighting internationally the difference of this new administration views from the previous one, to reassure partners and regain credibility. So there's indeed a demand and an interest in re-engaging in person after also the pandemic years, and after the years of the far-right government. So Lula 3 advanced reconstruction as the key word, and not only domestically, but also regarding diplomatic engagement. And
it's framing that as Brazil no longer wants to be the problem, but part of the solution, part of the solutions, and presenting itself as propositive, repositioning really since being active, positive player. And this is the narrative effort is taking a lot of the new administration team time. So in the international arena, the new government made the several movements to indicate that the environment would be a priority and that Brazil wanted really to engage in multilateral forums and leave the isolation behind and even seek protagonism, as we are seeing with Ukraine war proposal for peace that I will not address today, Nick. Nevertheless, there is a real gap in between the announcements we saw and implementation. The challenges in the institutional structure are taking time, and Congress not aligned and not committed to advance transformation in the environmental sector, to say the least. And there are consequential barriers to inspect environmental crime, to apply the protective measures. There is a lack of personnel on several federal agents. And the climate authority position that was announced with big fuzz inside the Minister of Environment is not yet being created, have not yet been created. So the government is being slow in recognizing indigenous lands that have been waiting for this last phase of the process. Also, the government will have to deal with controversial projects that potentially represent have environmental impact, such as BR 319, connecting Porto Velho to Manaus, and the oil exploitation on the Amazon River. So those projects can have the potential to threaten the government commitment with environment protection, and we will have international repercussion. The new administration will have also to engage with subnational actors. This is something we are following. We don't have a clear pattern, I think, in my view, for just 3 first months of how the new government will engage with the subnational actors that become very important during the Bolsonaro years. I'm talking about, for example, the Government Coalition for Climate. So it's something to have an eye on. Talanoa Institute is doing a great work monitoring government acts in the sector, generating data to analyze the ongoing transformation after the 4 years of Bolsonaro. So I'm sure Nathalie later will have more comments on regulation and implementation.
By the way, Luiz, if I can just interrupt you a little bit, because I think you gave a great leeway for us to bring Nathalie into the conversation. You mentioned the Talanoa Institute, which is doing a great job monitoring policy making in terms of the environment regulations. And Nathalie, thanks for waiting, and sorry for keeping you on the backstage for so long. But you guys have been monitoring the so-called reconstruction of Brazil's environmental apparatus. And like Luisa said, it has been slower than some anticipated. What has the government done so far, according to your assessment?
Thank you, Gustavo, and thank you also, Luisa, for bringing that up. I think it's not new to anyone here that Bolsonaro's government was one of capacity breaking, right? It really disestablished the environmental institutions, the climate policies, so on and so forth. They were partially successful because they were not able to reveal the Constitution of Brazil. If they have been done that, then we would have an even bigger problem. But the issue was that according to our tracking, and we've done monitoring systematically on a daily basis of all the executive orders, all the decrees, everything that has been done by the previous government, there would be 473 orders that should be undone or redone by a new government, right? And basically, this in the first days of Lula and Alckmin's government, there's been a lot of intensity. We saw very important measures and decisions being taken by the president himself, including, for instance, activating a very large operation in the Yanomami land in the border of Brazil and Venezuela. That was absolutely critical, I would say, part of an unavoidable agenda, right? And among some of the measures that were taken. But then after this first important and good positive first days, what we saw was a sort of slowdown, not only in terms of the volume of decisions that were made, but also we saw that no policy started to be developed. So basically what we have after 100 days of government is that only 5% of the overall package of decisions that were important to make only in the environmental and climate areas were taken. Basically, amongst the 112 of the most immediate urgent ones, only 12%. And that's because I don't think it's a lack of willingness or political willingness to do so, but it's really a lack of organization and also a signal that the sabotage that was perpetrated by the previous government was deep and very efficient. Just to sort of finalize this first comment, Gustavo, it's interesting to note that new ministries such as the indigenous peoples one, the human rights one, that don't have to rebuild anything, they are moving quite fast and forward, right? They are taking decisions, they are putting people in place, appointing and doing what's expected from them. Whereas the Ministry of the Environment, for instance, and I think both Bruna and Luiz already pointed out, it's been underwhelming because the people are not there. They don't have the pen. So nobody can really develop policy, right? I'm confident that is going to happen at some point. I don't think they're going to be, that they won't reverse the problems that were inherited from Bolsonaro. But the issue is really about timing. We know that this government has basically 2 years to get things done. Otherwise, we may see a far-right government also back in the game and trying to get elected again. So I think the time is the biggest enemy here. And so far, this government has been really slow in really in really using the time wisely and efficiently.
Luiz, I'm sorry I cut you the last time. Do you want to continue your? And then you and Natalie can go about the climate policies in the Lula administration and why it has been so slow.
No, I was looking to the international aspect of those of this agenda. So I think is important to make the to try to resume all that happened in this past 3 months. And like there's some important announcements that are aligned with some of the recommendations of the transition team and also the promise that Lula made during the campaign. So reactivating the South-South cooperation, and inside this, inside the South-South cooperation, bring the environmental aspect. So we have Brazil, Congo, and Indonesia that signed an agreement for Rainforest Protection Pact. This was in November during the Bali G20. So and it's being discussed for 10 years, so not exactly an accomplishment of the new administration, but there is a political will of the new administration, and the dialogue is happening, even though we don't know exactly how this mechanism for conservation will operate. We don't know how all the details about how they will facilitate result-based payment to reduce deforestation. So there are a lot of questions about this mechanism. At least I do have a lot of questions about this mechanism. But we also have the summit of the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization that now has a date. It will happen in the beginning of August. We'll bring together all the 8 Amazonian country leaders, and is this initiative that Lula is counting on to have a regional position about Amazonian protection, and he will bring this shared vision to the UN General Assembly in September here in New York. So that's the plan. And also the Belém is now this summit will happen in Belém, but also Belém is now a candidate city officially to host the COP30 in 2025, which was another promise. So it's like to conclude the announcements, the major announcements of this 100 days, or pass back to you, Gustavo.
And
Gustavo,
sure.
Can I add something on follow up on what Nathalie mentioned and Luisa, which I think is important. One is, I think one of the things that we always talk about when we see Brazil and the US looking at each other in the mirror as like big democracies is we have to figure out a way to demonstrate the world that democracies can deliver goods, can deliver things. And that's, it's challenging. And I spent a part of my life in Brasilia on the other side of the counter, like in the deep state, meaning like looking at how hard it is to deliver things. Nowadays, when you were talking about internally about policies, delivering, especially the environmental policies, it's the same as if you were like rebuilding the whole plumbing system at the same time of a house, at the same time you were building the second floor. So Lula has to basically like rebuild a number of like a structure to implement and enforce and deliver certain things, which is one aspect that we have to look at closely. In figuring out how to do that in a world where he has like all the fiscal constraints that he has, all the political constraints that he has, will be challenging. And we talk a lot about the whys and whats in policy here, and especially at the think tank level, but we don't look that much to the how aspect of things. And that's where our ambivalences like emerge. So when we were talking about, for example, foreign policy and the fact that we believe that Brazil can play a role in being an influential environmental steward and a regional leader, and even perhaps like a global peacemaker and having a role in that, I think it also relates to how we are actually thinking about how we are doing this. In terms of foreign policy, of course, the rhetoric and all the messages being sent matter a lot. And when it comes to the environmental and social policies, what concerns me a lot is the fact that the Brazilian state has today been like postponing reforms, such as an administrative reform that could enable certain delivering certain things, and also has been putting like more thought on how to actually redesign institutions to be more agile and delivering things faster. So that's one aspect that's not as perhaps interesting to talk about because it's sometimes boring and bureaucratic, but we have to when we are thinking about getting results faster.
And that brings me to my question to Nathalie, because this ambivalence, and like you said, it's like doing plumbing while building the second floor. Lula has at the same time pledged to zero Amazon deforestation by the end of the decade. But at the same time, he said that he wants to unclog development in Brazil through a lot of infrastructure work. And God knows we do need infrastructure work in Brazil. But a recent study shows that dozens of indigenous lands and dozens of preservation areas would be at risk, would be put at risk by several infrastructure works that are on the government's plan, not necessarily just this one. And then we have, for instance, also Petrobras, that recently pledged to drill oil in the equatorial margin as one of its business priorities, which is one part of this equatorial margin comprehends the mouth of the Amazon River. So, Nathalie, how do you see the government balancing these risks and rewards in terms of its infrastructure goals and its climate goals?
Gustavo, thank you for the question. I think it's very good. And let me just separate the environment and the climate aspects here, just because when we talk about environmental potential environmental impacts over indigenous peoples, for instance, coming from infrastructure, Brazil has the framework in place to deal with it. We have regulations for consulting indigenous peoples. We do have licensing, right? So it's about really using this framework and making sure, differently from what happened in the past with Belo Monte Dam, for instance, making sure this is going to be used and respected from the technical and the political point of view. But when it comes to climate change, and I think I like the question that you posed, because I listened to Lula's speech today, and it was really, really concerning from my point of view that he didn't connect the points. He spoke about infrastructure development several times. Then he spoke about climate as if we were living in a different planet, right? If you had the planet infrastructure and the planet climate. And that's a big issue. No country in this planet can afford building infrastructure that is not resilient, that is not going to be, sustain itself in a warmer and less stable climate. That's point number one. Point number two, we do need infrastructure, but what kind of? What kind of? And then comes Petrobras, and it's been very interesting to hear the various voices from this government, Lula, Marina Silva, and then the president of Petrobras, Jean Paul Prates, that has been saying that they're pointing in different directions, and particularly Jean Paul Prates recently said that they're going to develop infrastructure or development to this government from the Petrobras standpoint is about opening new oil fields in the mouth of the Amazon River, despite many technical and political and economic already signals that that's not the way forward. So this government, it's very positive that it does not want to be a pariah anymore. We are very happy about that. It's good to have a government that is not a proud pariah as the former one. Great. But then when it comes to coming to terms with rebuilding Brazil's credibility with sustainability, which was the sentence that we heard Tatiana Prazeres several times today, we need them to define with society what the sustainability is about. It's not defined. It's Lula and his ministers have been talking to a lot of different partners, China, the US, Europe, Norway, so on and so forth. Also very good. But there is no coherent strategy. There's no grand strategy so far. And then these ambiguities, and moreover, I don't think it's only controversial. I think it's counterproductive when you have like one country saying one thing and then pointing to a very different direction. I think it can do harm to Brazil because it can be sustained for 1 year, not for 4, not for 8. And then getting back to your point on the zero deforestation commitment, it's a very important one. And the test is 2025. So although Lula and all other politicians have been speaking about getting to zero by 2030, which is already very ambitious, But we have to bear in mind that the test is 2025. It's when Brazil has to show to the world that it has diminished its emissions according to the climate targets presented before the Paris Agreement. And also, we have to then try to combine the international and the domestic policies. So far, there's no coherence, there's no cohesion. And as I mentioned, I do believe that these ambiguities, they can do harm, not now, but in the medium term, in terms of attracting investments, in terms of proving our credibility for trade, so on and so forth. So very complex situation, and I don't think the 100 days have provided us a very clear picture on who is going to win in this balance of forces within the government and within the political landscape, I would say.
And Natalie, one thing that I found a little bit shocking is that Marina Silva, in a recent interview, compared the equatorial margin to Belo Monte, and Belo Monte was one of the reasons why she left the Lula government a decade ago, right? So that's like you said, people are not on the same page on that, and a little bit eye-opening.
Yeah, if I may, just one sentence more, Gustavo and all. When we talk about energy transition, we are all talking about phasing out fossil fuels at some point. We have to reckon that. We have to recognize that and really make that policies, even if long-term policies. I'm not saying that Petrobras should stop drilling oil today. It's not about that. It requires a lot of planning and real transition plans, but we cannot increase oil production and actually open the mouth of the Amazon for that, and at the same time say that you are in line with the Paris Agreement. These two things, they cannot happen at the same time.
Now, I have two questions from the audience, one for Nick, one for Natalie and Luisa. Actually, one for Nick and Bruna. I think both could get into this. But I'll start with Natalie and Luisa because we are already talking about the environment. And it's a question from Henrique Ortiz. And he says that, in his opinion, selecting Belém instead of Tabatinga and Leticia as the site for the Climate in Amazon Summit undermined the Amazonian unity on the subject because 40% of the Amazon is outside of Brazil. I would like you, both of you, if you can weigh into what Henrique said. Do you agree with him, or if not, why?
I have a very personal take on this. I've lived in the border of Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela, in the Amazon, and although I really appreciate the idea of having this type of conversations on the ground with real people in the border, we know that crime gained a lot of space, power, and wealth in these past years, particularly in regions like Tabatinga and so on. So I don't think it's safe to host conversations like that at the moment. And I'm more concerned about the quality of the conversation than precisely where it's going to be, situated. So that's my take for now.
Well, what about you, Luisa?
No, very similar answer. Of course, there is a symbolic aspect of having a COP in an Amazonian city. But yes, there are also logistic arrangements and very pragmatical decisions behind holding such an international event that will mobilize so many people, and those people will have to arrive. So logistical concerns about making possible that the international people coming from abroad will arrive on time. So larger cities often prefer it too. So
and Sede, you wrote a story recently about the fact that even Belém has a lot of limitations in terms of its touristic infrastructure, right, to house all the delegations in terms of lodging availability, transportation within the city, right?
Yes, so Belém is severely underprepared for hosting an event as big as the UN Climate Conference. Belẽm's biggest event every year, which is the Círio de Nazaré, far exceeds the hotel capacity, but a lot of people will stay at homes of their relatives. And with this story, I contacted both the state government of Pará and Belém City Hall. And the last major huge event that they can remember is the 2009 World Social Forum, which was held also in Belém. But this event is mostly young people who don't care much about where they sleep because they are young undergrads. You can feed them anywhere. They're full of energy. And it's not the case. It's not the same case about a high committee of diplomats from all UN member states. So Belém is going to have a very hard time to host this conference, or at least the negotiators who actually do the work are going to have a very hard time.
And
they have
Nathalie,
2 years to prepare.
I'm sorry?
They have 2 years to prepare. So.
And one question from a viewer named Johnson, and I would like to get Bruna and Nick on this. He said his interest in why Lula's trip to the U.S. was considered a flop, which I don't think it was considered a flop. Actually, on the contrary, at least if we talk about the mainstream analysts and policy analysts. But I would like to get...
Yeah. I think in my perspective, it was a very successful visit. I think both leaders had built a rapport there, and they are. I think it's as I said before. I think we are in a moment in time when Brazil and the U.S. are looking at each other in the mirror in certain aspects. I think there's a lot of empathy. There's a lot of similar priorities, and the climate agenda and defending democracy were both stated there as both Lula and Biden's priorities. And also, I think that the follow-up meetings were very successful with different missions to Brazil in after the presidential visit, which is a sign of success. It was short, of course, but I think when you look at, I think the enthusiasm and all the energy and the fact that Brazil was, in fact, the U.S. was recognizing that Lula's Brazil is back, and he's a Democrat with his small d, and someone who is committed to those values. Was a great success. I don't think it was a flop at all. And I think that some of the articles and analysis that we did, we had a podcast on that, right, Gustavo? Throughout those 100 years, a big portion of the work that we did was following the meetings and the conversations that happened here in DC and afterwards. And I respectfully disagree with you, Johnson. I don't think it was a flop.
Nick, you want to weigh in?
Sure. Briefly, I agree with Bruna and Gustavo that the visit wasn't a flop. I thought it was okay. It was a mildly successful visit. I think I'm a little bit more skeptical about it, perhaps because of what's happened afterwards than maybe Bruna is. It was a quick trip, and I think it got all of the symbolism right. Bruna just hit on that. I do think it was a recognition of Brazil's importance and also what both of the countries have gone through in terms of polarization and threats to democratic institutions and processes. It was very light on substance, really across the board. And that's not completely surprising, considering how new the Lula government is. But I think it's a relevant factor. We still don't really have a good sense of what the blueprint is for the relationship. And there are a couple different ways to think about that. Bruna is 100% right that building rapport at the head of state level is really important. And my sense from the reports and talking to folks in Washington and Brasilia is that they really did get along, Lula and Biden. and that can go a long way. But I think there's a lot more work to be done. And I think since the visit, we've seen Brazil not sign on to the joint statement for the U.S.-hosted Summit for Democracies because of differences over the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We saw in New York, where I am, at the UN Security Council, Brazil was the only Security Council country member to vote alongside Russia and China to open up a so-called investigation into the Nord Stream 2 explosions. And I'm not sure what the state of the visit to Beijing is now after Lula had to reschedule, but the size and length of the trip to Beijing, taking almost 250 businessmen, spending 4 or 5 days in comparison to just spending over 24 hours in the United States, alongside some of the comments I made more recently about the posture on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think has raised some questions. And I think that frustration is growing in Washington vis-a-vis the bilateral relationship. And so we have to take all of that in context. But again, I think calling it a flop is a misread too. I'm with my colleagues on that one.
Okay, so before we do our final remarks, I'd just like to call a small message about our report that we did, and it was prefaced by Bruna Santos, director of the Brazil Institute. So we'll be back in a few seconds with our guest's final remarks.
Before continuing the show, we'd like to introduce you to our latest release, our exclusive report on the first 100 days of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's third term as Brazilian president. Lula's 100 Days, Myriad Challenges and Unforced Errors is a valuable strategic tool that brings you in-depth analysis from our experts on the most important issues from the beginning of Lula's administration. In this exclusive report, you'll find insights and analysis on the government's support base in Congress, Brazil's return to foreign policy, fiscal, economic and environmental challenges, as well as how the administration is tackling social media regulation and planning to fight hunger. Don't miss this opportunity and use the coupon to get a 20% discount on the report. Enjoy your read.
All right, so on this final stretch of our Brazil 100 conference, I'd like to ask our guests for a final statement, something that what they expect for the next 100 days of the Lula administration, where we're going to see more action in terms of its relationship with Congress and in terms of the climate policy, diplomacy. So Bruna, do you want to start? Let's do the same order we did the conference. So Bruna, floor is yours.
Yeah, I think I expect, of course, less symbolic change, which mattered, of course, during the 100 days. I think Lula's decisions were very informed by the political legacies and the need for symbols. And the symbols, of course, mattered a lot in this period, but we need some more substantive change. And also, I think that from now on, I think we should definitely observe how the internal forces will play both across the executive, but also in Congress. But I think across the executive branch, I think we have important moves to look at as the big center parties are being distributed and have the power and the money distributed across this executive. So this is one of the things that we have to look closely as we move forward, and we will be looking at that here at the Brazil Institute and trying to translate that to the foreign audience. And thank you again for everyone to be here, and for you, Gustavo.
Thank you, Cede. What are you going to be looking at in this next 100 days?
So in the next 100 days, we're going to be looking at how Lula's main policies, big policies such as Bolsa Família, Minha Casa Minha Vida, survive or not after Congress should take a look at them and might make changes to them in the provisional decrees. And this also goes for Lula's new revision, very, very shadily negotiated revision in the sanitation framework, which involves billions and billions of reais in investments. And there are people in the opposition looking very carefully to change this newly enacted decrees, who basically tried to change what was in the law approved back in 2020, which is a debate that the Workers' Party, Lula's party, lost, and they're now trying to go back via provisional decrees. We are also going to be looking at whether or not the opposition can finally take their big prize that they want, which is the Joint Select Committee on the January 8 riots. If they are able to install this committee, there will be a lot of gaslighting, a lot of culture wars, and we are going to waste a lot of time talking about fantasies, conspiracy theories, and basically the Bolsonaro-led opposition trying to put a lot of chloroquine in the debate when we need less chloroquine and more serious policy.
Thank you, CD. Nick, what's your take on this next 100 years?
I don't have as good analogies as CD. I just want to put that out there. So I'm going to suffer by comparison. But in terms of geopolitics, some of the things I'll be looking at, obviously, Lula is wheels up today to Beijing. I think we'll know a lot about where Brazilian foreign policy is going after this visit. We also have Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov planning to visit Brasilia as a follow-up to Celso Amorim's visit to Moscow. That's also something that's on my radar, and I think much of the foreign policy making and punditry community. Of course, at the end of the year, we'll have another COP. So just to follow up on what Luisa and Nathalie were talking about, we want to see, much as I talked about wanting to see more of a framework in the U.S.-Brazil bilateral relationship, I also think, hopefully, as we build towards December and all of the multilateral negotiation that goes along with COP, we'll get a better sense of some of the topics that Luisa and Nathalie hit upon. And then, of course, I'd like to see how the Europe-Brazilian relationship evolves, particularly in light of the most recent comments on Crimea. You know, we frequently talk about the EU's concerns or demands or whatever caveats, whatever you want to call them, in terms of sustainability and the EU-Mercosur trade deal. But of course, geopolitics matters as well. And depending on how some of these other flashpoints I just mentioned evolve, I think it could also have an impact in ways that I can't foresee necessarily, but just an impact on EU-Brazilian relations as well. So those are some of the things that will be on my mind and that I'll be watching for the next couple months or next 100 days. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Nick. Luisa, what's on your radar?
Well, I think that the first 100 days were definitely easier because it's easier to do better and distance itself from Bolsonaro government in foreign policy. And maybe the government still have more time with announcements in foreign policy that takes longer. So they don't necessarily need to present anything concrete immediately. So I think they have more time on that. But gonna be looking not only from this the trip to China that starts tomorrow and potential green cooperation with China, but also Brazil as a guest of the G7 and the summit of the Amazonian countries in August soon. I think those are important dates in the Brazilian foreign affairs agenda in the days to come. I forget to mention the Amazonia Fund that was bring back to life, and the cooperation of Venezuela, the reestablish of diplomatic ties, Amazonian neighbor. This is also ongoing, and we are looking into. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things ahead, a lot of things that we are paying close attention. So thank you again, and give the floor to you.
Nathalie, thank you, Luisa. Nathalie, what are you going to keep an eye out for in these next 100 days or in this next year in the Lula administration, climate-wise?
I think first and foremost, we will be looking at how this government builds Paris-aligned climate policies, and if it really puts a new NDC, a new nationally determined contribution to a process of dialogue with society. In relation to that, I think another aspect we will be looking at is related to the so-called transversal or whole of government approach. I want to check whether this will lead to a healthy competition and whole of government policy making, or whether to fragmentation, competition, and less coordination. And finally, I heard, and unfortunately there wasn't time for us to really dig into the various bilateral partnerships that Brazil is envisioning on the climate and environmental areas. But so far, my view is that there are many trial balloons, including this issue on the carbon markets with China, which to me it's a totally rehearsal balloon, as we say in Portuguese. And I wanted to really check it out. I think this may lead to some solid partnerships, but so far it's more like some internal actors, domestic actors, trying to test the waters and to really find their own space in government, rather than real solid diplomacy strategy in the making. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nathalie, and I want to once again thank to all of our guests, Bruna Santos, Director of the Brazil Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. Cede Silva is the Brazilian Report's Brasilia correspondent. Nick Zimmerman and Luiz Duarte are global fellows at the Brazil Institute, and Nathalie Unterstel from the Talanoa Institute. Once again, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you on. And I hope we're going to do one of these very soon again. Have a good one.
If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It only takes a second and it will help us reach a wider audience. Or better yet, sign up for the Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and keep us going and growing. Thanks to our subscribers, we've been able to cover Brazil and Latin America extensively, and for our work, we've won and been shortlisted for multiple international journalism awards. And most recently, our exposé about the rise of hunger in Brazil was selected by the True Story Award as one of the world's 94 best stories of 2022. And in order to keep doing that work, we need your support. So go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Ewan Marshall, thanks for listening, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.